The snapping of frozen birch branches sounded like rifle fire in the brutal -71-degree air. Beatrice didn't fear the cold. She respected it. But when a shadow massive enough to eclipse the moonlight collapsed against her reinforced cabin door, the frostbite outside became the least of her terrors. 60 miles off the Kolyma highway, deep within the unforgiving heart of Yakutia, isolation is not merely a lifestyle choice. It is a physical entity. Beatrice Caldwell knew this better than anyone. At 72, the retired British wildlife biologist had spent the last 3 decades in this white expanse. When her husband, Thomas, passed away from a sudden cardiac arrest a decade ago, her colleagues in London expected her to pack up her research station and return to civilization. Instead, she stayed. The taiga had claimed her heart just as surely as it had claimed Thomas's life. Tonight, the temperature had plummeted to a staggering -71 degrees Celsius. It was the kind of cold that defied comprehension. If you tossed a cup of boiling water into the air, it would instantly vaporize into a cloud of ice crystals. Breathing too deeply without a thick woolen scarf could cause your lungs to hemorrhage. The timber of Beatrice's cabin groaned under the sheer compressive force of the dropping temperature, the logs shrinking and popping with startling violence. Beatrice sat by her cast-iron wood stove, sipping a mug of dark tea, the glow of the embers casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Her cabin was a fortress, heavily insulated and stocked with enough chopped wood and canned provisions to outlast a nuclear winter. She was reading an old letter from her former research partner, Arthur Pendleton, when the first impact hit. It was a dull, heavy thud. The entire front wall of the cabin shuddered. Beatrice froze, her mug suspended halfway to her lips. She listened, the silence of the wilderness pressing in against the walls. In the taiga, noise during a blizzard usually meant one of 2 things: a falling tree or a starving predator. Bears were supposed to be deep in hibernation. Wolves were a possibility, but they rarely threw their bodies against human structures unless driven mad by rabies. Then came a sound that made the blood in Beatrice's veins run colder than the wind outside. It was a deep, guttural scrape claws, large ones, dragging down the reinforced oak of her front door, followed by a low, rattling exhalation that vibrated through the floorboards. She set her tea down, her hands remarkably steady despite the spike of adrenaline in her chest. She walked to the small, thick-glassed window adjacent to the door and wiped away a layer of condensation. She peered out into the howling darkness, illuminated only by the pale, icy light of the moon reflecting off the snowdrifts. What she saw defied every fundamental law of the ecosystem she had spent her life studying. Collapsed on her porch was an Amur tiger. Tigers belonged hundreds of miles to the south, in the Primorsky Krai region. They did not venture this far north into the heart of the Yakutian deep freeze. The climate was entirely wrong. The prey was scarce. Yet, here she was, a massive, adult tigress. Her once vibrant orange coat dulled and matted with frost and dried blood. She was emaciated, her ribs visible even through her thick winter fur. The tigress let out a pathetic, shuddering whine, raising her massive head to look directly at the window. Her eyes, a piercing amber, met Beatrice's. There was no aggression in that gaze. There was only profound, bottomless exhaustion. Beatrice noticed the blood. It was pooling beneath the tiger's right shoulder, instantly freezing into gruesome, black icicles. Embedded deep into the muscle, glinting in the moonlight, was the twisted steel of a snare wire. It was a heavy-duty trap, the kind favored by rogue poachers like Simon Croft, a notoriously ruthless trapper Arthur had warned her about years ago. The tigress had likely dragged the heavy anchor log for miles before finally chewing through the wood to free herself, leaving only the biting wire tearing into her flesh with every step. She is dying, Beatrice thought, her scientific mind automatically calculating the animal's odds. The blood loss, combined with the catastrophic cold, meant the creature had perhaps an hour left before her heart simply gave out. Beatrice backed away from the window. The cardinal rule of the wilderness was non-interference. You observe, you record, but you do not intervene. Nature is cruel, and a desperate, starving apex predator is the most dangerous force on Earth. Opening that door was tantamount to suicide, But as Beatrice turned away, a sharp, high-pitched mewl pierced through the howling wind. She snapped her head back to the window. The tigress had shifted her weight, painfully rolling slightly onto her side. There, tucked tightly against the mother's sparse belly, shielded by her massive front paws, was a cub. It was incredibly small, perhaps no more than a few weeks old, shivering violently, its eyes squeezed shut against the bitter wind. The mother hadn't come to the cabin looking for prey. She had come because it was a source of heat. She had dragged herself through miles of -71-degree hell, tearing her own flesh to shreds, purely to find a chance of survival for her offspring. The tigress looked at Beatrice again, her head thumping weakly against the doorframe. It was a surrender. A desperate plea, bridging the gap between two entirely different species. Beatrice didn't think. She moved. Beatrice sprinted to her equipment locker. She bypassed her hunting rifle and instead grabbed her heavy-duty medical kit, a pair of industrial bolt cutters, and a tranquilizer pistol left over from her darting days, loading it with a heavy dose of Telazol. She threw on her thickest insulated parka, her heavy boots, and her thermal gloves. Her cabin featured a scene, a small, unheated antechamber between the heavy outer door and the insulated inner door, designed to keep the cold from rushing directly into the living space. It was still well below freezing in the antechamber, but it blocked the wind and was survivable. She stepped into the antechamber, locking the inner door behind her, and approached the heavy outer door. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She was about to invite 300 pounds of lethal muscle and instinct into her home. "God help me, Thomas," she whispered. She unbolted the lock and pulled the heavy door inward. The wind screamed as it tore into the space, blinding her with a spray of ice crystals. The tigress didn't lunge. She didn't even try to stand. She simply lay there, staring up at Beatrice. "Come on, then," Beatrice shouted over the wind, stepping aside. "Get inside. Move." The tigress understood the concept of shelter. With a groan that sounded like tearing metal, she dug her good claws into the wooden floorboards and dragged her massive frame over the threshold, the effort clearly agonizing. She collapsed completely once her tail cleared the doorframe. Beatrice slammed the heavy outer door shut, instantly cutting off the roar of the blizzard. The sudden silence in the antechamber was deafening, broken only by the harsh, wet, ragged breathing of the dying cat. Beatrice stood frozen, her back pressed against the door, the tranquilizer pistol raised and aimed directly at the tiger's skull. The tigress was a mere 3 feet away. The smell of her was overwhelming, a potent mix of raw musk, dried pine needles, metallic blood, and infection. The tigress raised her head, her lips peeled back, revealing terrifying, 4-inch yellowed canines. A low growl began to rumble in her chest, a sound that Beatrice felt in the marrow of her bones. The predator's instinct was taking over. She was cornered, trapped with a human, and her cub was vulnerable. "Easy," Beatrice murmured, keeping her voice incredibly low and steady. She slowly lowered the pistol, though she didn't holster it. "I am not going to hurt your baby, but I have to help you, or you both die right here on this floor." The cub, disoriented by the sudden stop, tumbled out from under the mother's paw and let out a frantic squeak. It blindly bumped into Beatrice's heavy winter boot. The mother lunged. It was a weak, pathetic movement, but still incredibly fast. Her jaws snapped inches from Beatrice's knee, her massive paw swiping the air. Beatrice didn't flinch. She stood her ground, looking down at the desperate mother. "Stop it," Beatrice said, injecting an authoritative bark into her tone. "Save your strength." Surprisingly, the tigress fell back, panting heavily, her eyes wide and glassy. The exertion had drained whatever reserve she had left. She draped her heavy head over the cub, pinning it safely against her side, and watched Beatrice with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. Beatrice knelt slowly, placing the pistol on the floor within arm's reach. She opened her medical kit. The first problem was the snare. The braided steel wire was deeply embedded in the muscle of the right foreleg, practically scraping the bone. The surrounding tissue was swollen and blackened from frostbite and restricted blood flow. "This is going to hurt," Beatrice whispered. She took the bolt cutters and edged closer. The tigress tensed, the growl starting up again. Beatrice ignored it. She placed her gloved hand gently but firmly on the tiger's massive, muscular forearm. The sheer heat radiating from the animal beneath the cold fur was astonishing. The tigress flinched violently, her head snapping toward Beatrice's hand, jaws parting. "Do it," Beatrice challenged the animal, staring directly into the amber eyes. "Bite me, and then bleed to death." For a long, suspended moment, human and apex predator stared at one another. It was a silent conversation of survival. The tigress exhaled a long breath that puffed white in the cold antechamber air. She rested her chin back on the floor, keeping her eyes fixed on Beatrice's face, but she stopped growling. She had accepted the pact. Beatrice slid the jaws of the bolt cutters under the thickest part of the steel wire. It was incredibly tight. She had to use her entire upper body weight, pressing down on the handles. The tigress let out a sharp, agonizing roar, a sound of pure pain that echoed off the small walls, her claws tearing deep gouges into the wooden floorboards. Snap! The thick wire gave way. Beatrice quickly used heavy pliers to pull the jagged ends of the steel out of the ruined flesh. Fresh, hot blood immediately welled up from the deep puncture wound, steaming in the cold air. The tigress whined, a pathetic, almost dog-like sound, her body trembling violently. I know. Beatrice soothed, working quickly. She grabbed a bottle of potent antiseptic and flushed the wound. The cat flinched, but didn't strike. Beatrice then unpacked a large, military-grade pressure bandage, wrapping it tightly around the massive leg to stem the bleeding. Through it all, the tiny cub watched from the safety of its mother's flank, its bright blue eyes locked on the strange, two-legged creature fixing its world. Beatrice sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands shaking slightly now that the immediate crisis was over. She looked at the tigress. The bleeding had slowed to a manageable seep, but the animal was still severely dehydrated, starved, and suffering from extreme exposure. "You can't stay out here," Beatrice muttered, realizing the absurdity of what she was about to do next. The antechamber was sheltered from the wind, but it was still -20 degrees inside it. The injured mother and the fragile cub wouldn't last the night here. Beatrice stood up and unlocked the inner door to her living room. The rush of blessed, wood-stove-heated air spilled into the cold antechamber. She looked down at the massive carnivore. "Well," Beatrice said, stepping into the warmth of her home and leaving the inner door wide open. "If you're going to eat me, I suppose I'd rather it be where it's warm." The transition from the lethal, sub-zero void of the antechamber to the sweltering heat of the main cabin was a violent shock to the tigress's system. She did not walk. She hauled herself forward in a staggered, agonizing belly crawl. Her massive front claws dug deep into Beatrice's hand-woven woolen rugs, pulling her 300-pound frame inch by excruciating inch toward the radiating warmth of the cast-iron stove. Beatrice quickly secured the inner door, sliding the heavy iron deadbolt into place. The finality of the metallic clack echoed through the room. She was now sealed inside a 20 by 20-foot wooden box, with a desperate Amur tiger. The tigress finally collapsed 2 feet from the stove's glowing grate. The sudden exposure to extreme heat caused the ice matted in her fur to melt rapidly, sending up plumes of steam that smelled intensely of wet earth, copper, and wild musk. The tiny cub, still clutched tightly against its mother's flank, began to squirm, letting out a series of demanding, high-pitched squeaks. The warmth had revived its appetite. Blindly rooting through the damp fur, the cub found a teat and began to nurse, the rhythmic suckling sound filling the quiet cabin. Beatrice stood by the door, allowing her own racing heartbeat to settle. Her scientific training kicked in, overriding her primal fear. She observed the mother's respiratory rate. It was shallow and erratic. The blood loss from the snare had compromised her circulation, and the sheer caloric deficit of starvation was shutting her organs down. Heat alone would not save this creature. She needed fuel, and she needed it immediately. Moving with deliberate, exaggerated slowness to avoid triggering the animal's prey drive, Beatrice backed away toward her deep-freeze pantry. Due to the permafrost, her cellar was essentially a naturally refrigerated cavern, but she kept an emergency chest freezer powered by her solar battery bank for immediate access. Inside lay several heavy, butcher paper-wrapped haunches of venison and caribou, gifted to her by indigenous Evenki herders the previous autumn. She hauled out a massive, 15-pound slab of caribou shoulder. It was frozen solid, hard as granite. Beatrice threw it into a large galvanized tin basin and poured 2 kettles of boiling water over it, tossing in a handful of coarse salt to accelerate the thawing process. The scent of raw, warming meat hit the cabin air. Instantly, the tigress's head snapped up. Her amber eyes, previously cloudy with exhaustion, locked onto the tin basin with terrifying, laser-focused intensity. A low, rumbling growl vibrated from her chest, rattling the teacups on Beatrice's kitchen counter. The predator was waking up. "Patience," Beatrice said, keeping her voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "If you eat it frozen, your core temperature will drop again, and you will die." For an hour, a tense standoff ensued. Beatrice sat in her rocking chair, a loaded .30-06 Winchester rifle resting across her knees, watching the beast. The tigress watched the meat. As the outer layers of the caribou thawed, turning the water in the basin a dark crimson, Beatrice used a pair of heavy iron fire tongs to fish out a 3-pound chunk of raw flesh. She tossed it across the floorboards. It landed with a wet slap a few feet from the tiger's nose. The tigress didn't hesitate. Her jaws snapped out with blinding speed, crushing the meat and bone with a sickening crunch. She swallowed it almost whole, her eyes never leaving Beatrice. Over the next 2 hours, Beatrice systematically fed the animal the entire 15 pounds of caribou. With every bite, a visible change washed over the massive feline. The shivering stopped, her breathing deepened, becoming a steady, powerful rhythm. The glassy look in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. By midnight, the tigress had curled into a massive orange and black crescent around her sleeping cub, her head resting on her massive paws, watching Beatrice with unblinking vigilance. Beatrice finally allowed herself to brew another cup of tea. She turned to her ham radio setup in the corner of the room. It was her only lifeline to the outside world, a complex array of dials and vacuum tubes. She switched it on, intending to monitor the local weather band for updates on the blizzard. Instead of the automated weather loop, the VHF frequency crackled with the harsh, static-laced hiss of a shortwave transmission. "Tell you, Gideon," she went north. The tracks veer straight off the ridge toward the old British woman's sector. Beatrice froze. She recognized that voice instantly. It was Simon Croft. "Simon, it's -70 out here." A second voice, "Gideon," whined through the static. "The snowmobile engines are struggling. We're going to freeze to death for a damn pelt. That pelt is pristine, and it's worth 60,000 American dollars to the right buyer in Harbin." Simon barked back, his voice dripping with venomous greed. "She's dragging a 50-pound anchor log, bleeding out. She can't have gotten far. We follow the blood before the fresh drift covers it completely. If she's dead in the snow, we skin her. If she dragged herself to the old lady's cabin for heat, we take it from her. The old bat won't put up a fight against the two of us." The transmission clicked off, replaced by the howling static of the atmosphere. Beatrice looked slowly from the radio to the massive predator resting by her stove. The tigress wasn't just a refugee from the storm anymore. She was a bounty, and the most ruthless men in Yakutia were currently driving straight into the teeth of a lethal blizzard to claim it. Beatrice set her teacup down. Her hands were no longer shaking. She walked over to her heavy oak ammunition cabinet, unlocked it, and pulled out a fresh box of high-grain cartridges for the Winchester. "Well, my girl," Beatrice whispered, loading the heavy brass rounds into the rifle's magazine one by one. "It seems we are both going to have a very long night." The blizzard raged for another 14 hours, transforming the landscape outside into an unrecognizable, shifting ocean of white. Inside, a bizarre domesticity had settled over the cabin. The tigress, fueled by the heavy meat and the ambient heat, had regained a shocking amount of vitality. She had spent the morning thoroughly grooming herself and her cub, her raspy tongue working diligently to clean the dried blood and matted ice from her coat. Beatrice had managed a few hours of fitful sleep in her armchair, her hand resting on the stock of her rifle. When she awoke, she found the tigress sitting up, staring intensely at the front door, her ears swiveling like radar dishes. Then, Beatrice heard it. Beneath the howling shriek of the wind, there was a mechanical, high-pitched whine. It was the strained roar of two heavy-duty snowmobile engines fighting their way through the deep drifts. The engines cut off abruptly, plunging the area outside back into the natural chaos of the storm. Heavy boots crunched against the wooden steps of her porch. Bang, bang, bang. "Caldwell, open up!" Simon Croft's voice was muffled, but unmistakable through the heavy timber. Beatrice stood up. She looked at the tigress. "Back," she commanded quietly, pointing toward the darkened archway that led to her small bedroom. To her absolute astonishment, the intelligent creature seemed to understand the shift in the atmosphere. The tigress picked her cub up by the scruff of its neck, padded silently into the shadows of the bedroom, and vanished from sight. Beatrice walked to the inner door. She didn't open it. "Go away, Simon," she shouted, her voice ringing with authority. "You are trespassing. The weather is breaking. You have enough fuel to make it back to the highway." "Don't play games with me, Beatrice," Simon sneered through the door. "We tracked the blood right to your porch steps. I know the cat is in there. Hand over the animal. We'll do the skinning out back. And we'll leave you in peace. Try to hide it, and I'll burn this cabin down with you inside." Beatrice gripped the Winchester. "There is nothing here for you." A heavy, metallic smash echoed through the cabin. Simon was using a steel crowbar on the outer Sini door. The frozen wood shrieked and splintered under the assault. A second blow shattered the latch, and Beatrice heard the heavy outer door crash open. The freezing wind immediately roared into the antechamber, dropping the temperature in the main cabin instantly. Heavy footsteps stomped into the Sini. Now, only the inner door separated Beatrice from the poachers. "Last chance, Granny," Simon growled, his voice now just inches away on the other side of the wood. Beatrice backed up, leveling the barrel of the Winchester directly at chest height. "Break that door, Simon, and I will put a bullet through your heart." A shotgun blast deafened the room. Simon had fired a 12-gauge slug directly into the lock mechanism of the inner door. The metal deadbolt shattered, showering the inside of the cabin with shrapnel and splinters. The door swung violently inward, slamming against the wall. Simon Croft stood in the doorway, a hulking figure wrapped in heavily frosted furs, a smoking shotgun in his hands. Behind him stood Gideon, looking terrified and clutching a hunting rifle. Simon's face was a mask of cold fury, his beard caked in ice. He stepped into the warmth of the cabin, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto Beatrice, who had her rifle aimed squarely at his chest. Simon laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "You're not going to shoot me, Beatrice. You're a scientist. You patch things up." "You don't kill them," Simon said, taking a slow, menacing step forward. "Now, where is my $60,000? "I warned you, Simon," Beatrice said, her finger tightening on the trigger. Before Simon could take another step, the shadows in the bedroom doorway seemed to detach themselves from the wall. It wasn't a roar that preceded the attack. It was a sound much more terrifying. It was a deep, concussive cough, a displacement of air that signaled the sudden movement of 300 pounds of pure, coiled muscle. The tigress exploded from the darkness. She didn't run. She launched herself in a single, devastating parabolic arc. She bypassed Beatrice completely, clearing the space between the bedroom and the front door in a fraction of a second. Gideon didn't even have time to scream. The sheer size and speed of the beast paralyzed him. The tigress landed directly in front of Simon. She didn't bite him. Instead, utilizing the terrifying lateral power of her species, she swung her massive left paw. The blow struck the barrel of Simon's shotgun with the force of a swinging anvil. The steel weapon was violently wrenched from the poacher's grip, the wooden stock snapping cleanly in two as it flew across the room and smashed into the kitchen counter. Simon was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the impact, crashing into Gideon. Both men tumbled out into the freezing antechamber, scrambling wildly on the floorboards. The tigress stood in the threshold, completely blocking the exit. She lowered her massive head, her ears pinned flat against her skull, and released a full-throated, ear-splitting roar. The sound was a physical wave of dominance, shaking the dust from the heavy ceiling beams and vibrating deep within the chests of the terrified men. It was the raw, unadulterated fury of the wild, defending its sanctuary and its savior. "Christ! Oh, Christ!" Gideon shrieked, scrambling backward on his hands and knees out the shattered outer door and into the blinding snow. Simon, his shoulder dislocated from the blow, scrambled frantically after him, his bravado entirely evaporated, replaced by the primal, desperate terror of prey. Beatrice stepped up beside the massive tiger, racking the bolt of her Winchester with a sharp, metallic clack. She leveled the sights on Simon's retreating form as he dragged himself toward the snowmobiles. "Do not ever return to this sector, Simon." Beatrice's voice cut through the howling wind. "If the cold doesn't kill you, she will. And if she doesn't, I will." The snowmobile engines roared to life, panicked and revving too high. The headlights cut a chaotic arc through the swirling snow as the two men fled, abandoning their prize, their pride, and their broken weapons. Beatrice stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the taillights fade into the whiteout. The tigress remained by her side, a silent, heavy sentinel. When the sound of the engines was finally swallowed by the storm, the great cat turned her massive head, briefly pressing her cold, wet nose against Beatrice's heavy parka in a gesture so startlingly gentle it made Beatrice's breath catch. Then, the tigress turned and walked back inside, heading straight for the warmth of the stove. 5 days later, the brutal low-pressure system finally broke. The wind died down, and the sun broke over the horizon, painting the endless miles of snow in brilliant, blinding hues of gold and pink. The temperature had risen to a manageable -30 degrees. The tigress had eaten the last of the frozen caribou. Her limp was gone, her eyes were bright, and her strength had fully returned. She paced restlessly by the front window, her thick tail swishing in slow, deliberate arcs. The wild was calling her back. Beatrice understood. She walked to the heavy door and pulled it open. The cold air rushed in, crisp and sharp. The tigress stepped out onto the porch, her cub trailing eagerly behind her, its small paws leaving tiny indents in the fresh powder. At the edge of the tree line, the massive mother paused. She turned back to look at the small, sturdy cabin, and the old woman standing in the doorway. There was no sound, no dramatic gesture, only a long, final look of mutual understanding between two survivors who had bridged the impossible gap of their species. Then, with a flick of her tail, the tigress turned and vanished like a ghost into the white depths of the taiga, returning to the ruthless, beautiful world where she belonged. In the merciless heart of the Yakutian taiga, survival is rarely a solo endeavor. Beatrice Caldwell's daring choice blurred the ancient line between human and apex predator, proving that profound empathy can exist even at -71 degrees. The wilderness is uniquely brutal, but it remembers. A mother's love recognizes its own reflection, forging an unbreakable, silent pact born in the absolute darkest depths of the frozen world.